Hey there everyone, Mr. Lewis here. I hope you're doing well. We're ready to move forward with our exploration of agriculture here in AP HuG today, and we're going to do that by covering section 7.3, which is all about one very important person in agricultural geography, Johann Heinrich von Thunen. And von Thunen developed this really important model called von Thunen's model. See, that's a nice thing. If you develop something original, you can name it after yourself. And von Thunen's model is all about land use. What he was trying to do was establish this theory, this model, for the most cost-effective ways to use the land in terms of agriculture. In other words, what land should be used for dairy farming? What land should be used for livestock? What land should be used to grow wheats and grains? This is what von Thunen was trying to get at with his model. And so today, essentially what we're going to be doing is looking at a giant target, a giant bullseye from the center, which would be the center of the town where all the human activity is and where people live, to the outer edges. And what you're going to be trying to do is figure out which products, which farm goods would be best placed in which sections of the target. In other words, if you were living in the center of this giant circle, what would you use the center for? What would you use the ring just outside the center for? And as we get farther and farther away from your homestead, what are we going to use these different sections of land for? These are the answers that von Thunen's model are going to provide for us. So without further ado, let's take a look at section 7.3, von Thunen's model. Okay, so first of all, remember section 7.3 is all about land use. Which parcels of land should be used for which agricultural purposes? Your challenge here throughout these few slides that we're going to use to cover section 7.3 is to do your best to answer the questions that are presented as we consider what the von Thunen model will look like. So I'm not going to give you the exact model until we work through a few questions. Our entire goal is to maximize profits. This is done not just by making a lot of revenue in sales, but also minimizing the cost of rent, minimizing the cost of transportation, and minimizing the cost of waste or food going bad. So to do all these things, we have to consider some assumptions that von Thunen was making in his model. One is that the more perishable the product, the closer to the market the farmer would locate. So which ring would have the highest perishability and which ring would have the lowest? The ring with the highest perishability would be ring 4 because it is the farthest from the market center. The market center is where people live and trade. Think of it like the farmer's market, but there are also homes. It's like the urban city center, right? And then rings 1, 2, 3, and 4 get farther and farther away from that market center. So the ring with the highest perishability would be 4 because it's the farthest from that market. The ring with the lowest perishability would be ring 1 because it's the closest. Now we have to consider the cost of land. This is where we use bid-rent theory. And the bid-rent curve assumption says that the land that is the most desirable and accessible will be the most expensive. Land that is the least accessible and least desirable will be least expensive. That makes sense, right? And we can see that on these curves over here. What you notice with these curves is that for each of them, they are pointed downward, right? Or in other words, they have a negative slope. There's an inverse relationship between the y-axis and the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the cost of land, and on the x-axis, distance in miles from the market. So let's put all this together. If there's an inverse relationship between these two variables, what that says is that the more distance you are, the greater distance you are in miles from the market, the lower the land would cost. On the other hand, as we get closer to the market or the city center, the land costs more. So that's the bid-rent curve assumption. There's an inverse or indirect relationship, a negative relationship between the distance from the city center, the distance from the market, and the cost of that land. So, which ring would have the most expensive land? Ring 1. Which ring would have the least expensive land? Ring 4. Another thing we have to consider is the cost of transportation. The farther you are from the market, the higher the cost of transportation we're going to experience. So ring 4 would have higher transportation cost, and ring 1 would have the lowest transportation cost. Putting all this together, minimizing bid rent, the cost of transportation, the cost of waste, what we're going to see is that ring 1 has the highest land cost because it's closer to the market center. That's the bid rent theory. There's a low cost of transportation, and there's going to be less waste, less perishability because it is so close to the market center. On the other hand, land 4 is going to be less expensive because there's high transportation costs associated with it. The bid rent theory is at play. We're farther away from the market center, so the land would cost less. And then, of course, there could be more waste, right? So we're all the way far away from the market center. That's going to take a long time, and thus the chances of perishability are much higher. So putting all these things together, we have to ask ourselves exactly what von Thunen was asking himself, which is, where do we put which activities? Where do we farm which goods? So here's what I'd like you to do. Take a second and try to place each of these 6 items that you see down here into one of these 4 rings. Try to predict what von Thunen said regarding which farm goods should be planted or grown or raised in which of these 4 parcels of land. Take a moment, pause this video, and see if you can correctly place those goods. So, what we should have ended up with is something that looks like this. This is von Thunen's model. In the center, we've got the urban center or the market. What von Thunen said is that in ring 1, we should have dairy farming and market gardening, vegetables, fruits, and dairy. In ring 2, forest land. In ring 3, grains and field crops. And in ring 4, ranching and livestock. If you think about why these play out the way they do, a big part of it in ring 1 is perishability. Dairy farming, right? Dairy is something that is easily perishable, especially in 1826. And so von Thunen said that should be closer to the city center. Forest in ring 2 always kind of throw people off because we wonder, well, why forest land? Why would you want forest land separating the market center from, say, the grains and field crops or the ranching and livestock? And the reason is lumber is something that is very difficult to transport. So from the forest land, we're getting lumber, right? Timber, wood. And it's a difficult thing to transport, especially in 1826, at a great distance. So that should go in ring 2, said von Thunen. And in ring 3, we have grains and field crops. And then in ring 4, the largest ring with the most land, we would have ranching and livestock. Lots of room for grazing. And remember, this model was created in this isolated state, right? To try and find the most cost-effective use and the most cost-effective methods of agriculture, of agricultural behavior. And this location theory was in 1826. So, of course, a couple hundred years ago, there are some missing items here in this isolated state, and we have to consider that. But first, try to answer some of these questions in your own mind. Why are dairy and market gardening in the first ring? Why is wood, forest in the second ring? Why are grains and cereal crops in the third ring? I just kind of went through and explained a little bit of that, and you can rewind this and take a look again at or listen again to what I said regarding those 4 rings, but see if you could put that into your own words. Finally, considering von Thunen's model today, how might changes in technology affect the location of these products? How might changes in transportation technology and systems affect the location of the products? And finally, how might globalization and international trade affect the location of these products? And some people have asked themselves this over time, and von Thunen's model has been modified for more modern conditions. So here's the isolated state that we just saw on the left. Here are the modified conditions. We have a waterway that we can easily use for transportation all the way from the market center out to the edge, right? So instead, what ends up happening is this. Whereas with von Thunen's isolated state, these circles were closed off, now they're extended to the outer edges of the circle. So we can have market gardening and dairy production all the way along the river edges, the water's edges, out to the edge of the circle. We can have crop farming without fallow. Fallow means to let the land sit without farming, all the way around that river, that water source, instead of just one big circle, right? All the way to the edges. So this is the modified state of von Thunen's model, taking into account modern technology, modern systems, different innovations that we've developed in agricultural behavior over the last couple hundred years. And because of those things, we can modify the land to even better meet our needs when it comes to farming. So that's it for von Thunen's model. No assignment or activity to go with this today, just an important piece of agricultural geography. So we will pick up again with Unit 7 tomorrow when we dive into Section 4, Types of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for tuning in, and I appreciate your time as always. I will see you tomorrow. So long.